Hello and welcome to the BMJ's podcast. I'm Kamran Abbasi, Editor-in-Chief of the BMJ. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Phil Banfield,
Hi,
who's
Karen.
Chair of the BMA. Hello, Phil. Thanks
Hi.
for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I know you've got a busy day. It's been in the High Court today. We'll talk about that in a moment. But just to be clear with everybody, the BMA, the British Medical Association, owns the BMJ. But the BMJ, of course, is editorially independent, and we've always had the support of the BMA. In that independence, I know Phil very much champions that for us. So, Phil, thank you for that ongoing support. Let's talk a little bit about you to begin with, in case anybody isn't quite as familiar with the BMA as BMA members, because the audience for this podcast is much broader than BMA members. So tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do at the BMA.
So, I'm chair of the BMA Council, a day job. I deliver babies for a living. So I'm an obstetrician in North Wales and have been there for 30 years.
What persuaded you to go for the job as the UK chair?
Well, I mean, there's the obvious and trite answer of if you don't have a go, you never know whether you're going to succeed or not. But I knew that because of being chair in Wales, I'd got a lot of experience dealing directly with politicians, dealing across different branches of practice, and also bringing a culture of inclusion and diversity to Wales.
Yeah.
That I felt was kind of missing, if you like, on the English scene.
Okay.
And therefore, it seemed logical at the point at which people were telling me the BMA doesn't really represent us. It's not doing what we think it should be doing. We want the BMA to be more of a trade union.
Yeah.
I thought, well, there's an angle then to sell myself as, which is to listen to the grassroots members and say, let's make the BMA into something that people want to belong to.
But did you think the BMA needed to be more of a trade union? Was that something you already thought?
That's something that's been a regular occurrence across my career. It seems to me as if we've spent our careers learning to reach the top of our game, and then really it feels in the NHS as if the NHS doesn't value that.
Okay.
So it doesn't want us to be the best of our game. It wants to accept mediocrity. And doctors are not mediocre, but that's the way that we're.
Sorry, mediocrity in terms of performance.
Well, performance and in expectations. People in this country, across the four nations of the UK, cannot practice medicine in the way that they expect, to the standard they expect, and that goes back many years to the chronic underfunding from the last government. What it's resulted in is people accepting that as normal, accepting it's normal to have patients in corridors, accepting that it's normal to be examining chests from chest pain patients in the middle of an ED waiting room. That is something that was going on before COVID. The waiting lists were getting worse before COVID. COVID exacerbated it. And now we're trying to dig the profession into a space that says, do you know what, we've had enough. All right, we're going to stand up for our patients. We're not going to let the NHS deteriorate any further.
So you're talking about the state of the health service, the environment that you work in, that you're limited in that sense in terms of delivering the optimal care that you want to deliver.
Yes, it is. But it comes back to the empowerment of doctors being able to exert their professional voice. So as I was standing to be chair of the BMA, I saw the BMA having three kind of legs to it. One was the obvious financial leg of us being a company owning the BMJ. The second one was the professional association, being an expert in numerous topics, world-renowned opinion. And the trade union bit, the grassroots were saying to us, we're falling short on that. And of course, that focused then around the campaign to restore doctors' pay to where it was before the financial crash of 2008.
Okay, in terms of that, then they were your drivers for applying for the job and getting the job. How far do you think you've gone towards achieving what you set out to achieve?
Well,
In July 2022, wasn't it?
yes.
Yeah.
So what I did was I took all the things that I thought people had been telling us were wrong with the BMA, wrote them on a chart, thought, what do we actually want to be in 2 or 3 years' time?
Yeah.
I was obviously very aware that there was a general election coming up, and therefore there were leverage points around the general election. So I started with the general election and worked backwards, wanting to improve the BMA and take all of the things that people have been saying were wrong with the BMA and trying to make progress with them. So diversity and inclusion and ethnicity bias, gender bias, all the things that had come up in reports that were wrong with the BMA. Let's not just write another report. Let's make it change.
First of all, in terms of improving the BMA's record on diversity, but also some of the issues that we know have historically been there around representation within the BMA, particularly on its committees. In your time as chair, have you improved representation from ethnic minorities and women on your committees?
Yes, quite markedly so. Now that isn't to the point at which we want to stop, because there's still more progress to make.
Yeah.
The next round of committees will be coming up, and we are now working to make sure that representation and it goes all the way across the organisation.
So you're almost 3 years into into being chair of the BMA. Where do you think the organisation now needs to go?
But what we've demonstrated is we can change a lot, but we're rather hampered by the structures and the silo working, both within the kind of organisation itself and within the membership.
Yeah.
So our next strategy is to change structure into function and taking a function approach.
What do you mean? Can you just explain what's a function?
So function. So organising to win. Right, as a campaigning to influence, making sure that we've got the structures in place that will enable that to happen. The BMA seems remote, and what we need is the people to feel that the BMA is with them, all of the time. So instead of having to phone the BMA to speak to someone who's remote, you know who your BMA rep is very early on, and that allows us to intervene much earlier in the process.
So this relates back to what you were saying earlier about kind of devolving the service that you have in terms of away from the committee-centric approach.
Yeah, and what it does is it makes it much more agile, it makes it much more responsive to what's going on the ground and what matters to members.
Can you give me an example of how this locally focused approach can work? Do you have an example of that?
Well, I mean, probably the best example has been the work that we've been doing in the Isle of Man. And that's quite a good example on 3 fronts. One was supporting whistleblowing, raising concerns. Their chief medical officer was effectively hounded out for trying to raise patient safety concerns around COVID and trying to keep the island safe. And that resulted in a payout of over £3 million.
Yeah,
which is just unheard of. But then we've been able to help them take industrial action or raise a dispute with the Manx government, Manx Care, and they've just won a pay award by organising locally. And then, of course, the professional aspect, because the Crown dependencies have also been looking at physician-assisted dying. We've been able to put our expertise, make that available to them,
yes,
and help them there as well. So that ability to structure ourselves functionally around the locality, because there are so many employers who are just frankly abusing doctors, and that has to stop.
Okay, but just to be clear about how it worked, you had people, you empowered and supported people locally to address the challenges and the issues they were facing. I mean, you were involved. So what you're saying is there's a greater balance in terms of the balance. There's a shift in balance to people locally taking on the dispute,
Yes,
rather than centrally controlling everything.
Yeah. So centrally we're there to provide advice. It's still always my name on the strike notices.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so there is always
You're troublemaker in
there is
chief.
always some central input.
Yeah.
And it's very much a work in progress, but that gives us focus and direction. And that's what we hope to achieve across the next 18 months to 2 years.
Okay. The other main thing that you talked about was industrial action around pay. There was a settlement. I mean, I know it was, it moved you a fair distance, but you were going to observe what happens this year and in future settlement. You saw that as a success, that first settlement that you reached with this new government?
Yes, because it was a first step. All right. It was a credible offer. I mean, indeed, it wasn't that far from the numbers that we were talking with the previous government. So it seems a bit bizarre that the previous government didn't choose to settle.
But for the record, can you say why it was impossible to negotiate with the previous government? Because when you did settle, I mean, I know there was criticism saying, well, of course, the BMA would settle with Labour. They didn't settle with the Conservative government. But what was it in the negotiations that you found difficult to reach agreement with the previous government?
Well, I mean, they were saying one thing behind the scenes and a different thing on the table. So, there were different bits of the last government that would not get the deal across the line when it seemed pretty obvious to everyone that there was a deal to be done.
Yeah.
That is water under the bridge now. This present government is aware that this is unfinished business. This was a first step towards pay restoration. The consultants, as part of their settlement, had reached agreement with changes to the Doctors and Dentists Review body over its independence, its ability to look at comparable professions, its ability to look back at whether pay is appropriate for what might have been. And so, we're very much in that, well, if the DDRB does its job, we will make a further step forwards. If the DDRB does not do its job, well, we could be back into negotiations and we could be back into dispute.
When are you planning to reevaluate, or it's an ongoing process?
Well, yes. I mean, it obviously depends when the DDRB report comes out.
Yeah.
We've got a promise that it will not be delayed like the previous government has delayed it. If there are delays, then that will make us sceptical about the commitment of this government. Okay. And I can't see the resident doctors being patient enough to let that drift.
No. I guess one unknown is, I mean, when you were given the awarded the pay rise by the new government, if there is another dispute, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how that plays out with the public.
Well, I mean, the argument that we had from the very start was that this was about the cost of expertise and the need to retain doctors in this country to treat patients. You can't have a 7.5 million waiting list backlog and not have doctors treating them, or then not make great efforts to retain doctors in this country. And of course, that the irony is that we end up then paying lots more money than you would if you gave a decent pay rise and started to restore that pay in locums or external agencies or insourcing or outsourcing of work.
Yeah. And are you having ongoing conversations with the government at the moment, or are you waiting to see what the DDRB review
Well,
says?
Unlike the previous government, we spend a lot of time talking to this
Okay.
to this government. So those conversations are taking place all of the time, and that's a healthy place to be. So that we get an understanding. It is quite clear to us. Here is the cost of that medical expertise.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's a political choice to afford that cost or not.
Okay. Do you feel your message is getting through?
Yeah, I mean, it's we've had very positive conversations. The government understands that it needs doctors to clear its waiting lists, and we are up for those conversations.
Okay. I mean, having said all this, obviously, I remember what it was like to be a resident doctor, back in my day, and I know, and now it's much more difficult for early career doctors in terms of career progression, to get the training that they want to get. And there's a whole host of other issues, aren't they, Phil, that need to be addressed as well.
It's very much started to feel like you're just a number on a spreadsheet being shoved around, a system.
Yeah.
There's no coordination between, where you've lived, where you've trained, where your family is, and where you might end up going. So, it's fair to say that training in the UK at the moment is a mess.
Yeah.
And it bears no relationship to the workforce need. So, you have this complete contradiction where you are 1,900 anaesthetists short, but only 400 or so training places. But then, 2,000, 3,000 people applying for them. Why not train them now?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that lack of joined up thinking from NHS England, Department of Health and Social Care, employers has been probably one of our biggest frustrations. And, it's a fragmentation of the NHS that is been incredibly destructive, not just to the NHS, but to training the next generation of doctors.
Yeah. I mean, clearly to me, it's a failure of workforce planning.
I don't think there's been any workforce planning, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I find that bizarre.
Right. Yeah.
I find that bizarre.
Well, we hear there's a lot going on.
My 40 years in the NHS, I've never seen a credible workforce plan, and that's because no one really.
What about the last one?
Well, how can you do a credible workforce plan and not actually talk to the frontline doctors that you're expecting to deliver it? I mean, that just beggars belief that the BMA was excluded from that.
Sure. And it was
a piece of work.
It was a plan that was talked up a lot, wasn't it?
Well,
but I take your point about it.
Please, and I know the BMJ's been doing this. What is our future NHS? What is it? What is it that we're going to provide or not provide? How is it going to be paid for or not paid for? These are discussions that politicians need to have with the public. We will provide that service. We champion the NHS. I mean, there's an irony in that, isn't there? That started the NHS, the BMA was opposed to it, and now we're the ones saying no, this can be done.
True. Okay. I mean, one aspect of this, which I think has been discussed recently, has been the issue around international medical graduates. And I know there was an announcement from the Resident Doctors Committee that UK educated graduates should get preference when it comes to specialty training. And I know you issued a clarification around that. Do you want to just explain what the BMA's position is on that particular point? Because that was a point of concern for international medical graduates who work in the NHS.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing to reflect on how the BMA is organised, because as you know, there are the different branches of practice that will have their own committees, but the actual overarching BMA policy is decided at the annual representatives meeting. So we encourage all sorts of conversations to take place. And what I've said while I've been chair of council is I don't just want the conversations that you want us to hear and have taking place.
Yeah.
I want you to have the conversations that are difficult to have as well. And then we'll work through those. And that is one of those conversations that the resident doctors have had about how do we deal with the ridiculous bottlenecks in training that sees our own foundation doctors unable to progress into specialty training. And that then becomes difficult. Who should fill those places? Our health service, ever since its inception, has been dependent on international medical graduates. Right?
Yeah.
They have been, a huge backbone to our NHS. But have they come across here to get experience, or have they come across here for training? And what is that training that they are being offered? So sometimes what we are seeing is employers are going to other countries, inviting people to come and train, when really what they say is, can you come and do some work in the NHS and then go back to your own country? What we've been really lucky is we've seen a lot of those people then stay in this country and train and work as consultants and GPs in this country. But someone has to work out how to get that balance and where the discussion should be. And the biggest call that I've seen for people who are worried about this has come from our ethnic minority UK resident doctors. So they've grown up in the UK.
Who are you UK trained?
UK trained.
Yeah.
Who already feel as if they're having discrimination into the workplace.
Sure. Which they are.
All right. And they're saying, how can we work this out? So my job, our job as chief officers, has been to say, right, let's have that wider conversation now. Let us make sure that our international medical graduates really do appreciate how valued they are, and let us sit down and work out what the policy should be. That helps every single member of the BMA.
Okay, so but you're not. That isn't a policy that you hold, which is that UK graduates should get preference over international medical graduates.
So what we've got is some policy from 2002, which is a policy about making sure that UK graduates and international medical graduates who are in the UK,
who are in the system,
who have the system, have preference to bringing people from abroad.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So you're making a distinction between international medical graduates who are working in the system, have worked in the system, and then applying for a specialty training post, versus international medical graduates who haven't worked in the NHS.
Don't encourage people from abroad until you've made sure that you've got maximum and optimal employment for the people who are already here.
Yeah.
But of course, the difficulty is that no one is addressing the real elephant in the room, which is every single member of the team needs training.
Yeah.
Right. So whether you're on a training program or not a training program, we need to up our game about making sure that everyone is trained. And, it's incredibly difficult to get equivalent training. The hoops that you have to go through if you're going through the equivalent route are really tough, and the GMC keeps bouncing things back to you. It's really demoralizing.
Yeah.
And that's got to be simplified. In fact, actually, the GMC is trying to simplify that process. But we need to work because there's an issue, right? And we need to work that issue through, and then come to policy for the future.
Okay, I'm going to move us on from this. I think we could have a very long conversation, because I think we all have empathy for resident doctors, and in terms of their pay and their conditions and their career progression. It's a very complex issue, and within the context of suboptimal, if not absent, workforce planning, as you're describing. Can I ask you about what you've been doing today in the High Court, which is your case against the GMC in relation to physician associates? I mean, the detail of that is that you're contesting the terminology. Well, you're contesting they should be described as medical professionals. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It's it's bizarre. I think the GMC was set up to make sure that the doctor you were seeing was qualified and able to be treating you as a doctor. Now, since December, the GMC regulates non-doctors. We feel it's got a statutory duty to make the distinction clear, using the word medical professional to cover associate professionals and doctors. It's really confusing when doctors are registered medical practitioners. The actual AAPA order, so the legislation as tabled, didn't use the word medical in it at all.
Yeah.
So, there is overlap with the 1983 Medical Act of, this is really confusing. Here are the doctors, they are the medics, they are the medical professionals. And we are seeing in practice the confusion for patients and the public. I mean, if I have two drugs with similar names, epinephrine, ephedrine, in my anaesthetic theatre, different effects, different doses, mix them up, one can kill. 2018, there was a government warning about propranolol versus prednisolone.
Sure.
Right. So what you do when there's confusion because it looks similar.
I take your point. It's a safety point.
You separate them out. So there was very much a patient safety issue.
Yeah, but you're not objecting to physician associates per se. I mean, you might object to the name, but you're not objecting to the fact that there are other professionals working in the multidisciplinary team.
I would take issue that whether they're a profession as such, they're an occupational group.
Yeah, okay.
They don't have a unique body of knowledge.
Yeah.
They're a subset of
but they're allied
medicine.
health professionals.
So, that assistant type role has a role in the team. There isn't a doctor on the planet that wouldn't appreciate that kind of assistance. And of course, the role is defined at graduation, but what happens beyond that is undefined, and hence the Anaesthetists United court case that is looking at scope of practice.
Okay, can I ask you two quick questions, Phil? I mean, one thing that baffles me is why physician associates need to be regulated by the GMC, because we also have the Healthcare Professionals Council, which is an alternative body that might regulate physician associates. Why do you think there is that insistence?
Well, that was a conscious decision of the Department of Health.
Yeah, but what do you think?
Care.
Why do you think's behind that?
I leave other people to speculate over that, but it has clearly caused confusion.
Okay, Phil. Finally, what if you were to think back? Eventually, your term will be over. You're like, in 2 years' time, perhaps. There's a limit of 5 years, isn't there? When you look back, what would you like to think you've achieved in your time as chair of the BMA?
I think that's very simple. I think I would want people to look and say, "Wow, this is such a different BMA from 5 years ago."
Phil, thank you very much.